Soviet Union covers some 5,000 miles from the Baltic to the Pacific, connecting Europe with Asia. People often call the whole area Russia, the site of the Soviet capital, Moscow. Although Russia is only one of 15 republics in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Russia is by far the largest state, and it has for centuries ranked among the world's major powers. Russia is where the revolution began that gave birth to this vast union of states. Until the mid-13th century, Russia was divided into loosely organized trading centers along the country's great rivers. These centers were stopping points for travelers on a major European trade route from Scandinavia to the great trading and metropolitan center of Constantinople. These separate centers shared allegiance to the Eastern Church, which in 1054 split its ties to the Western Roman Catholic Church. In place of Latin, the Eastern Church now used a new Slavonic language with a different alphabet, drastically reducing cultural exchanges between East and West. In 1240, most of Russia was invaded from the east by the Mongols, who then ruled for more than 200 years. The Mongols established an autocracy based on absolute allegiance to their leader, the Khan. When the Mongols were finally routed by Ivan the Great in the 15th century, one autocracy was gradually replaced by another. Ivan claimed all surrounding lands in the name of his state, Muscovy, or Moscow, where he established a centralized government. His grandson, known as Ivan the Terrible, adopted the title Tsar, the Slavic form of Caesar. He seized and redistributed land, requiring in return military service and other duties to the state, consolidating an authoritarian social structure that lasted for centuries. At the head of this structure was the Tsar. His authority was enforced locally by the landowners, who collected taxes for the state and ruled the peasants in their regions. As time passed, the rights of peasants became more and more restricted, until by the 17th century, most peasants were serfs, that is, slaves who belonged to and could be sold by the landowner. Tsarist governments were tied so closely to the Eastern Orthodox Church that the Tsar was considered a ruler by divine right. The Eastern Church believed that piety was more important than knowledge, and therefore paid little attention to education and intellectual pursuits. As a result, the people of Muscovy were cut off from such dramatic cultural and political developments as the Renaissance, the exploration of the New World, the discoveries of Galileo, and the Protestant and Catholic Reformations, which were profoundly changing Western Europe. Toward the end of the 17th century, Tsar Peter the Great tried to establish closer links with some countries in Western Europe. To give Russia a window on Europe, he built a new capital, St. Petersburg, on the Baltic Sea. Hoping to increase Russia's power in the world, he borrowed many technological and industrial ideas and even imported technicians from the West. But the changes did not alter the autocratic power of the Tsar, the feudal structure of society, or the lot of the serfs. In fact, the population was increasingly regimented to work for the state. Large factories and mines, subsidized by the state, could draft serfs to work in them. In contrast to Western Europe, where land and industry were both owned by private individuals or companies, in Russia, agricultural and industrial development were dominated by the state, which meant by the Tsar. Peter the Great's interest in Western Europe was viewed with suspicion by many conservative Russians, especially the hierarchy of the Orthodox Church. An ongoing conflict developed between those like Peter, who thought that Russia's isolationist views were hampering her growth, and those who believed that Western ideas would corrupt the soul of Holy Russia. In the 18th century, Russia reaped the benefits of Peter's policies. During the reign of Catherine the Great, Russia became a major force in Europe. She expanded her western borders by participating with Austria and Prussia in the partition of Poland. When the monarchy in France was overthrown in the French Revolution of 1789, under the battle cry of liberty, equality, and the brotherhood of man, Western ideas became less welcome in the Russian court. From 1812 to 1814, Russia and other European powers resisted the armies of Napoleon, who tried to expand French influence across the continent. As Russian soldiers marched across Europe, they came into contact with the ideas of liberty and equality. Exposed to forms of government in which the people had a voice, they realized how few rights the Russian people had under Tsarist rule. Secret societies formed in Russia aimed at ending autocratic rule. Taking advantage of the sudden death of Tsar Alexander I in 1825, a revolutionary group called the Decembrists tried unsuccessfully to establish a more democratic form of government. The new Tsar, Nicholas I, reacting to the Decembrists' attempt, isolated himself in the Winter Palace and ruled harshly, protected by a network of secret police. Nicholas also supported autocrats elsewhere, when in 1848 and 49, Western Europe was torn apart in a series of revolutionary uprisings. Russian troops entered Hungary to help restore the power of the Austrian Empire and crush a revolution that Nicholas feared might spread to his own borders. In the Crimean War, a few years later, Russia was defeated by the less autocratic nations of Britain and France. Russia's humiliating defeat reduced her stature as a major power and set back autocratic rule throughout Europe. Despite censorship and repression, Russian intellectuals continued to exchange ideas and to disagree about Western Europe. Those who saw European culture as superior became known as Westernizers, and those who saw Europe as decadent and materialistic were called Slavophiles. The Slavophiles did not want Russia's culture, rooted in the Eastern Orthodox Church, tainted by outside influences. Some of Russia's major literature was written during the 19th century. Among the writers who became world famous for their depiction of Russian society were Tolstoy, Pushkin, and Dostoevsky. Free speech was prohibited and censorship strict. Fiction, not so restricted, served as an outlet for expressing ideas and discussing issues. When Russian peasants in the 19th century showed signs of resistance to serfdom, Tsar Alexander II decided to make some major concessions. However, the nobility's wealth or power were not seriously diminished. The Tsar told the Russian nobility, "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for the time when it will begin to abolish itself from below." In 1861, the serfs were declared free. The nobles had to give up half their land, but they were compensated through government bonds. This land was turned over to the peasants, who owned it jointly in collectives called mirs. Each peasant had to pay his share to the mir, and the mir made mortgage payments to the government. The government used the money to pay off the landowners' bonds, so in effect, the mirs paid the landlords for the land. The growth of industry and the need for industrial workers gave impetus to freeing the serfs. In Western Europe, industry had continued to develop in the hands of private owners and had given rise to an important new economic and political force, the middle class, generally referred to as the bourgeoisie. In contrast, Russian industry was developed mainly by the state. Wealth remained in the hands of the nobility. The middle class was made up mainly of bureaucrats, professionals, and intellectuals, people not directly concerned with industrial development. With economic policy established from above, Russian industry developed according to the dictates of the state rather than the interests of private investors. The government was responsible for railway construction. The state bank became the keystone of the Russian credit system. Since the failure of the Decembrists in 1825, intellectuals had led the only organized opposition to Tsarist rule. But in the 1870s, some intellectuals came to believe that change depended on arousing the peasants to accept their leadership. Adopting the slogan, "To the people," young revolutionaries visited and worked in peasant villages to spread their ideas of social justice. But the peasants, worn down by the grind of daily life and generally supportive of the Tsar who had freed them, did not respond to these young idealists. While the idealists felt betrayed, other revolutionaries who advocated terrorist tactics became more active. A series of assassinations took place, culminating in the murder of Alexander II in 1881. Alexander's death gave rise to a series of anti-Semitic riots, or pogroms, throughout the countryside, in which many Jews were massacred. Jews had for centuries been persecuted in Russian society, and as a result, a disproportionate number of them belonged to anti-Tsarist organizations. In the minds of many peasants, Jews and revolutionaries were the same. The pogroms began because many peasants blamed the Jews for Alexander's death. The new Tsar, Alexander III, decided to use the peasants' anti-Semitic feelings to his advantage. To diffuse opposition and to distract attention from his new repressive measures, he made anti-Semitism official government policy. Laws denied Jews basic human rights, and pogroms were encouraged. But despite this new repression, fundamental social changes were taking place. Industry was growing, resulting in a shift of population from countryside to city. A new urban working class, what Europeans called the proletariat, was emerging. In the mid-19th century, the proletariat throughout Western Europe had begun to pay close attention to the ideas of a German socialist, Karl Marx, who, in collaboration with Friedrich Engels, had written a pamphlet called The Communist Manifesto. Marx argued that politics and economics were inseparably linked. He saw the history of social change as a succession of struggles between different classes in society. For example, in medieval Europe, the nobility made laws that favored their own interests. As the merchant class or bourgeoisie gained wealth and power, its members joined together to oppose laws that held them back. When the bourgeoisie demanded a voice in government, the nobility refused to surrender any power. That was the situation in France toward the end of the 18th century, when a revolution overthrew feudalism and the bourgeoisie established a pro-capitalist parliamentary government to represent its interests. Marx predicted that the next struggle for power would take place between the triumphant bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the workers who actually produced the wealth in a capitalist system. Marx believed that the bourgeoisie, like every ruling class in the past, would refuse to share power with the proletariat, and that the workers would eventually have to rebel against the bourgeoisie to gain their rights. He foresaw the end of capitalism and the beginning of a new social order called socialism, in which the workers controlled the government and the economy. Marx believed that people living under socialism would gradually learn not to be greedy and not to exploit one another. They would then be ready to live together in a peaceful world under communism, a system in which everyone would share in the world's wealth. Every able-bodied person would do constructive work, and everyone would be guaranteed food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, and education. The philosophy was summed up in the words, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs." Marx expected the revolution to happen first in one of Europe's advanced industrial societies, in Germany or Britain, where capitalism was most firmly established and a large proletariat had already emerged. In spite of heavy censorship, Marx's ideas found their way into Russia. In 1898, George Plekhanov helped to establish a new underground organization, the Social Democratic Labor Party, which tried to spread Marx's ideas. But the Russian secret police suppressed the organization, and most of its leaders were forced into exile. One leader who soon became a driving force in the party was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin. Lenin was a lawyer who came in contact with Marxists in St. Petersburg. In 1895, he traveled to Switzerland to meet Plekhanov and other revolutionary exiles. When he returned to Russia, he was arrested and spent 4 years in prison, where he studied and wrote papers on socialist theory. When he was released in 1900, he renewed contact with Russian exiles. They started a newspaper called Iskra, which means the spark. Printed in Europe, it was smuggled into Russia and distributed in industrial centers, where it helped spread Marxist ideas. Holding their second party congress in London in 1903, the exiled Social Democrats split into two factions, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Both groups accepted Marx's theory that socialism would come about in a capitalist society when workers rose in revolt against the bourgeoisie. Since Russia did not have a capitalist system, they believed that a capitalist phase would have to precede socialism. However, they disagreed over the kind of organization that would best accomplish their aims. The Mensheviks wanted to build a widely based workers' party that would seek to rule in cooperation with other liberal parties in a capitalist-style parliamentary government. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, advocated a tightly organized party of disciplined revolutionaries. They believed that a democratic organization could not stand up against the autocracy with its repressive police force and spy network. While these arguments were taking place among exiled leaders, Russia itself was in turmoil. Workers held one strike after another. Peasants, suffering more than usual as a result of famine, were crying for reform. Nicholas II, who would be Russia's last Tsar, hoped to divert the people from problems at home by embarking on an aggressive foreign policy. Early in the 20th century, Russia and Japan were at odds over their conflicting interests in Manchuria and Korea. Anticipating that a quick military victory would discourage agitation at home, Nicholas took steps that led to war with Japan in February 1904. But things did not go according to plan. The Russian Pacific Fleet was destroyed by the Japanese Navy. The Russian army, badly led and supplied, was also defeated. Instead of relieving discontent, the war, with its accompanying food shortages and inflated prices, made matters worse. On Sunday, January 22, 1905, an unarmed crowd of workers marched in peaceful demonstration to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Their petition to the Tsar included demands for a constituent assembly and an end to the war. Police fired on the crowd, killing several hundred demonstrators. The incident, called Bloody Sunday, marked the beginning of the 1905 revolution. Workers went on strike, and peasants seized their landlords' estates. In June, sailors mutinied aboard the battleship Potemkin, the pride of the Black Sea Fleet. Raising the red flag, the banner of socialism, the mutineers sailed the ship into Odessa harbor, threatening to spark an uprising in the city. By August, the Tsar was desperate. He announced that he would accept a consultative assembly called a Duma. But since the Duma would have no real power and workers were not to have a vote, protests continued, even after the Russo-Japanese War ended in September. Most of the Bolshevik leaders were still in exile, but the Mensheviks were active and had organized a Soviet, or Council, of Revolutionaries in St. Petersburg. Soviets quickly sprang up in all major cities. The St. Petersburg Soviet called a general strike that, from October 20th to the 23rd, brought the country almost to a standstill. Under pressure from his advisors, the Tsar reluctantly announced in his October manifesto that a constitution would be drawn up. He appointed Count Witte as prime minister. This satisfied the moderates and isolated the radicals. In November, the St. Petersburg Soviet called a second general strike, but the response was far less enthusiastic than it had been in October. Encouraged, the government arrested Soviet leaders. In December, the Moscow Soviet led an armed uprising and held part of the city for several days. But by January 1, 1906, the Moscow uprising, and with it the 1905 revolution, had been crushed. The Duma that the Tsar had promised met in April 1906. But the Tsar felt strong enough to disregard demands for reform, and in July he ordered the Duma dissolved. 200 delegates traveled to Viborg, Finland, where they met and called on the Russian people to rise and protest against the dissolution of the Duma. But there was no response to their call. Tsar Nicholas then appointed as Prime Minister Peter Stolypin, a conservative, iron-handed but far-sighted man. Stolypin wanted to ensure that the peasants supported the Tsar and not the revolutionaries. He initiated a program of land reform. He began to break up the mirs, which were still collecting payments from the peasants, and to allow the peasants to own their own land. Terrorism escalated as Stolypin relentlessly tried to wipe out the revolutionary movement. He was assassinated in 1911. During this time, new Dumas were elected, but since the election laws had been changed to guarantee that they were packed with conservatives, they approved whatever the Tsar wanted. This was the political situation when World War I began in August 1914. A system of international alliances pitted Britain, France, and Russia, known as the Allies, against Germany and Austria. The war started over a seemingly minor incident, the assassination of the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The assassin was a member of a secret society based in the independent Slavic state of Serbia. His organization was fighting to build a new nation of southern Slavs, including those in territories that had been swallowed up by the empire. Austria-Hungary responded to the assassination by attacking Serbia. The Tsar felt obliged to rally the Russian people, who were also Slavs, to fight on Serbia's side. He even changed the Western-sounding name St. Petersburg to the Slavic Petrograd. Once again, he hoped that a patriotic war would help distract an increasingly restless population. But his efforts ultimately proved futile. The Russian army was poorly equipped and lacked trained personnel. It fared badly in the war. More than 3.5 million people had died by the end of 1915. The rest of the population suffered enormous hardship. Inflation meant that workers' incomes could not keep up with rising prices. Food shortages led to an outbreak of strikes. Even bread was beyond the reach of most people. While people in the capital had no bread to eat, the Tsar and his court continued to live in luxury. People were suspicious of the Tsar's German wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, and of her advisor, a decadent hypnotic monk, Rasputin, who seemed to be running the court and was widely considered a madman. By the end of 1916, the hostility against the Tsarist regime that had begun on Bloody Sunday 11 years earlier was at the boiling point. On February 23, 1917, bread riots broke out in Petrograd. The people erected barricades. Troops and police, often more sympathetic with the rioters than the court, refused to fire on them, and in many cases they joined the protesters. As this spontaneous uprising took place on the streets, a revolution was taking place in the Duma. On March 12th, the Tsar dissolved the Duma, but the deputies refused to leave and instead formed a provisional government composed mainly of moderate bourgeoisie. On March 15th, the Tsar abdicated. The Petrograd Soviet, suppressed since the failure of the 1905 revolution, was reorganized under Menshevik leadership. The revolution spread quickly throughout the country. Soviets were set up in Moscow and in the towns. Composed mainly of workers, these Soviets exercised local control, often vying for power with the new provisional government. Lenin returned to Russia in April with the help of the German government, which hoped that his intervention would work against the Russian war effort. His return mobilized the Bolsheviks. By now, Lenin believed that the Russian people were ready to move directly toward socialism. He no longer saw the need to establish a capitalist system first, and urged his followers to support the Soviets instead of the bourgeois provisional government. His slogan, "All power to the Soviets," became a challenge to the Mensheviks for control over the revolution. Alexander Kerensky, Minister for War in the Provisional Government, hoped that a successful offensive against the Germans would raise morale and his government's prestige. When the offensive failed, the government was discredited. Soldiers deserted their regiments. Demonstrations and riots broke out. Kerensky, fearing a Bolshevik takeover, tried to discredit Lenin, accusing him of being a German agent. In the resulting uproar, Lenin once again had to flee to Finland. But the provisional government's troubles were not over. Kerensky's failure to control rebellious strikers and peasants angered Russian conservatives. In August, they persuaded General Kornilov, commander-in-chief of the Russian army, to lead a right-wing coup to overthrow the provisional government. Mensheviks and Bolsheviks joined forces to resist Kornilov. The attempted coup collapsed without a shot being fired, but Kerensky's prestige was weakened, and Bolshevik power in the Soviets was strengthened. On October 7th, Lenin slipped back into Petrograd and took direct control of Bolshevik strategy. The Petrograd Soviet appointed Leon Trotsky to head a military committee to plan a revolution against the provisional government. Kerensky, realizing that the troops garrisoned in Petrograd would not support him in a struggle against the Soviet, left the capital on the morning of October 25th. On the same day, revolutionary troops occupied key points in Petrograd. Red Guards surrounded the Winter Palace where the provisional government was meeting. The following morning, they moved into the building, carrying out a well-executed coup d'etat. While Bolshevik troops took over Petrograd, the All-Russian Congress of Soviets was in session. Although the Mensheviks denounced the coup, the Bolshevik majority prevailed and established a government with Lenin as president. He issued 2 decrees. One decree nationalized the land and placed it in the hands of local Soviets. In many places, the peasants had already seized the land, but the Bolshevik decree officially combined the demands of the rebellious peasantry with those of the revolutionary proletariat. Lenin's other decree called for peace among the warring nations, ending with an appeal to the workers of Britain, France, and Germany to join in the peace effort. Lenin fully expected workers in the industrial nations to follow Russia's lead. Proletarian uprisings did take place elsewhere, but none were successful. In November, an election was held for a constituent assembly, with the Bolsheviks winning only 175 seats out of 707. In Lenin's view, the constituent assembly represented the interests of the bourgeoisie, while the Soviets represented the proletariat. In January 1918, the Bolsheviks dissolved the constituent assembly. The move evoked little or no protest, since the institutions and principles of bourgeois democracy had no broad popular support. But popular feeling was clearly in favor of an end to the war against Germany. The Bolsheviks signed a treaty with the Germans at Brest-Litovsk. Defeat cost Russia 1/3 of its farmlands, more than 4/5 of its coal mines, and more than half its industries. In March 1918, Moscow replaced Petrograd as the nation's capital. At this time, the Bolsheviks had firm control of Moscow, Petrograd, and most of central Russia. But various counter-revolutionary groups occupied outlying areas. Some were led by former Tsarist officers who wanted to restore the autocracy. Others were members of ethnic minorities who wanted independence. Others were members of political parties who sought power for themselves. When these groups launched a series of military attacks against the Bolshevik Red Army, Russia became embroiled in a bloody civil war. Anti-Bolsheviks were known collectively as whites, but they never operated as a unified force. They vied for power among themselves and finally lost favor with their own people when they accepted help from foreign countries, including Britain, France, and the United States. Russia's former allies landed troops at various Russian ports, purportedly to recover weapons supplied to the Russians during World War I. The Allies hoped that the Bolsheviks could be defeated in the Civil War and that a white Russian government would re-enter the World War against the Germans. While they allowed Allied weapons to fall into the hands of the White Army, they shot Bolsheviks who tried to avail themselves of the same weapons. The Civil War dragged on for nearly 3 years. Millions of lives were lost in battle, in famine, and in atrocities committed by passionate adherents of both sides. Finally, in the autumn of 1920, the Civil War ended with a decisive Bolshevik victory in the Crimea. The Bolsheviks were now officially leaders of an exhausted, devastated country, and they faced a monumental task in trying to rebuild it. Although the state had always directed the economy, even under the Tsar, during the Civil War, the Bolsheviks went even further, consolidating control of the entire economy, nationalizing large-scale industry, banking, and trade. Under a policy called war communism, the Bolsheviks took control of all factories with 10 or more employees and set up large collective farms. To feed urban workers and the armed forces, peasants had to give the state all food not needed by their own families. Peasant disturbances broke out periodically, and agricultural production declined. An even more alarming sign of discontent occurred in March 1921, when the Kronstadt naval base, formerly a stronghold of Bolshevik supporters, rose in open rebellion against the Bolsheviks. Although the rebellion was quickly suppressed, it convinced Lenin of the need for reform. He introduced a program which he called the New Economic Policy, or NEP. Under the NEP, peasants had to contribute only a percentage of surplus to the government after meeting their own needs. The peasant now had an incentive to produce. The more he reaped, the more he could sell privately. Private retail trade was also restored under the NEP, but major industry, banking, transport, and foreign trade remained under state control. Slowly, the Russian economy began to revive. Central Russia was named the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. In 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially established. Outlying areas such as the Ukraine, with different ethnic populations, were given some degree of local autonomy. The Soviets described the Union as national in form, socialist in content. Lenin died on January 21, 1924, leaving his successors with the task of consolidating socialism at home and establishing the new nation's status in the world.